Some punishments were meant to teach a lesson, others were pure nightmare fuel. Let's take a trip down the darkest path of human cruelty. Number 10. The Rat Dungeon. If you were alive in medieval London, chances are you'd have heard whispers of the infamous Rat Dungeon, a place that struck fear even into the most hardened criminals. This was a pitch-black cell buried deep beneath the Tower of London. Shackled and alone, prisoners were locked in total darkness. But the real horror? The dungeon was situated just below the river's waterline. When tides rose, rats living along the riverbanks would flee their homes straight into the dungeon. To the prisoner, the nightmare began with the faint pitter-patter of tiny feet. Within minutes, those soft sounds multiplied until hundreds of rats swarmed the cell. The rats, panicked and starving, began nibbling away. The prisoner might fight them off for a time, but exhaustion always won. While they slept, the rats continued feeding. When they awoke, they were covered in raw, bleeding bite marks. The punishment lasted days, sometimes weeks, depending on the crime. And as the medieval era progressed, this torment transformed into a slow execution. Victims were simply thrown in and left to be devoured. Number 9. The rack. Another horror courtesy of the Tower of London. The rack was a tool of pure agony. Used widely across Europe, it served one main purpose: to extract confessions, whether real or not. The contraption resembled a long wooden frame, fitted with rollers at both ends. The prisoner's wrists and ankles were tied to opposite rollers, and two officials would begin slowly cranking the device, stretching the body further and further apart. With each turn, the joints, shoulders, knees, hips, and elbows began to tear. Most victims screamed out whatever their torturers wanted to hear, truth or not. Confess, and you might be released crippled, dislocated, or paralyzed. Refuse, and the torment continued. In 1447, a 25-year-old woman named Askew was subjected to this ordeal. Her crime? Reading and preaching the Bible privately, something forbidden unless you followed the Catholic Church. She refused to give up the names of her fellow worshippers, even as every joint was torn from its socket. In the end, she was carried to the stake in a chair and burned alive, betrayed by her own husband. Number 8. Keelhauling. This gruesome naval punishment was reserved for violent or thieving sailors, and almost always ended in death. The process was simple and horrifying. A sailor's hands were tied, a rope was looped around the entire ship, and the rope was then attached to his feet. With one heave, he was thrown overboard. Crew members pulled the rope tight, dragging him underneath the ship, scraping his body across the sharp, barnacle-covered hull, especially the keel, the ship's underside. He'd be gasping for air, crushed, and torn open all at once. And if he somehow survived the first pass, he might get pulled around again or be left to slowly die from infection. Rare survivors lived with scars that marked them for life and carried the shame of being mocked by their shipmates. Number 7. Crushed by elephants. Now we move to punishments where death wasn't just possible, it was guaranteed. Crushing by elephant was common in many countries, with India being one of the last to practice it well into the 1800s. And the crimes? As minor as unpaid taxes or petty theft. In one horrific case, the fourth Mughal emperor ordered dozens of prisoners crushed simply because he was bored. People were crushed for stealing fruit, for jaywalking, even for speaking out. But the executions weren't just brutal, they were theatrical. A man would be placed on a pedestal, arms tied behind his back, and the elephant, under a trainer's command, would stomp on his head. Other times, the victim was laid flat and slowly trampled. The worst version was excruciating. The elephant was instructed to crush each limb one at a time, then skewer the body with its tusks before finishing with a fatal blow. The goal wasn't just death, it was dominance. A message from the rulers: we control life, death, and elephants. Number 6. Impalement. Few punishments matched the horror of impalement. Practiced in places like Egypt well into the 1600s, it was used against rebels, robbers, and dissenters. First, the victim would be restrained on their stomach, arms bound. A razor-thin incision was made at the base of the spine, widened by hand, and coated in a clotting paste. Then came the stake, a greased, sharpened pole as thick as a man's arm. With brutal force, it was hammered into the body until it emerged from the chest, shoulder, or even the mouth. The victim was then planted roadside, left on display like a warning sign. Another version spared the victim for a while. Here, the stake was positioned to keep them upright but not immediately fatal. They'd be left writhing and bleeding in agony, crying out to passers-by until they slowly succumbed to the pain. Number 5. Peniculii. Latin for penalty of the sack. This punishment was reserved for the worst betrayal, killing a family member. First used in ancient Rome and later adopted by 18th century Germany, It began with the murderer being sewn into a leather sack, but he wouldn't be alone. Inside the sack were a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. Once sealed, the bag was tossed into a river. The struggle inside was chaotic, snarling animals and a drowning man, thrashing in a doomed battle. Later, some convicts were given a twisted choice: the sack, or death in the Colosseum, torn apart before a cheering crowd. At least they had options. Number 4, rat torture. One of the most deranged punishments in history involved, you guessed it, rats. The first method, used during the 80 Years' War, was grotesquely simple. A rat was placed in a clay bowl on the prisoner's bare stomach, chest, or face. The bowl was then heated with hot coals. Desperate to escape the rising heat, the rat would do the unthinkable: burrow into the body. It would claw and chew its way through muscle, organs, and bone in a frantic bid to survive. If that wasn't awful enough, the second version, used under Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, involved placing a rat in a tube and inserting it into the victim's rectum. The rat, panicked and wild, would dig forward into the body. Victims were expected to answer questions while this happened. Many never returned. Others came back broken beyond repair. Number 3, gibbeting, also known as hanging in chains. This method was still in use into the 1900s. It became notorious in England after the Murder Act of 1752 required all murderers to be publicly dissected or displayed in a gibbet. The gibbet was a metal cage, fitted tightly to the body, suspending the criminal high above the ground. Unable to sit, move, or lie down, they would slowly die from dehydration, starvation, or exposure. Even in death, their bodies were left hanging, sometimes for decades. Locals complained of the unbearable stench, and some gibbets reportedly held remains for over 20 years before being cleaned. In Boston, Massachusetts, pirates were gibbeted along the harbor to send a clear warning to incoming ships. Number 2, scathism. The Persians perfected the art of prolonged suffering with this method. A convicted murderer would be strapped inside a hollowed-out boat, arms and legs protruding. Then came the milk and honey. Gallons were force-fed until the victim was bloated. His body was smeared with the same sweet mixture before being set adrift on a lake. The purpose? To attract insects and rodents. As the man lay exposed, bees, flies, and wasps swarmed his body. The milk and honey, combined with the resulting diarrhea, created a foul feast. But the torment didn't end after a day. Each morning, more honey, more milk, more insects. Rodents eventually gnawed their way into his body through any available opening. One account describes a man surviving 17 agonizing days, his skin rotting, body crawling with worms, and face blanketed by biting insects. Number 1, oubliette. From the French word meaning to forget, the oubliette was exactly that, a place to be left and erased. Found in castles across Europe, the oubliette was a tiny, lightless dungeon. In London's Tower, there was one so small that prisoners couldn't stand, sit, or lie flat. Warwick Castle's oubliette was even worse, deep underground, with a heavy iron door sealing it shut. The prisoner was thrown in and abandoned, often with a corpse already decaying beside them. Rats feasted freely, and screams echoed into silence. In some cases, the oubliette was built at ground level so the prisoner could hear life continuing above, just out of reach. Some cells were never cleaned. At Leap Castle in Ireland, a secret oubliette was found behind a chapel wall in the early 1900s. It was filled with so many skeletons, they needed multiple cartloads to remove them. And in rare cases, prisoners survived for years, fed just enough to stay alive, tormented by the faint sounds of laughter they'd never share in again. History's darkest methods leave one question: how far would you go to survive? Subscribe for more chilling tales.